Hello and welcome to another Crystal Confab, where we're going to talk about, well, not actually a crystal, but someone that is, I would argue, if not at the top, definitely in the top three most famous or infamous mineraloids, crystals that exist out there. It's an impactite, and of course, we're talking about Moldavite. Are we ready to dive in to this mystery from Czechia?
I think we are, and it's become quite, I guess, more infamous over the last decade. Without kind of divulging our ages, we've all been into crystals and the like for, let's say, a few decades, and we remember that it was always an expensive crystal. I remember when I bought my first ring of Moldavite, it wasn't a cheap thing. But it has gained popularity more than the other impactites like Libyan desert glass that we've already talked about. And now the prices have gone through the roof, and I'm amazed how much people are spending on and small, insignificant pieces. And when we kind of have these pieces, which used to kind of be, well, they were a decent size. I don't. I could probably buy a house with this now. No, I'm joking. But do you know what I mean? They're quite expensive. But I'd really love to know about before they became all the rage and they were spoken about on social media and TikTok a lot. Nicholas, what's the kind of history of Moldavite?
This is kind of a fascinating topic because unlike a lot of other crystals that are popular in the world today, we don't have very much written about Moldavite until the 1980s. In fact, not until 1988 in particular, but that doesn't mean it hasn't seen any action. We actually have material evidence of humans using Moldavite that goes back upwards of 30,000 years ago. We have no idea if it held any special significance to them. We assume it must, because it was different to other materials that they made similar artifacts from. So, of course, I'm talking about the kind of Aurignacian and Cro-Magnon civilizations. And they used raw Moldavite to nap like flint and chert into very small, but otherwise very sharp tools, arrowheads and blades and the like, and very near to where the Venus of Willendorf was discovered. This is a very famous carving that is assumed to be a goddess. It could also just be someone's great aunt Martha. We don't actually know because there's no label. These folks did not speak anything resembling a modern language, and there was no written counterpart for us to decode. So, there's a lot of assumption taking place here. But very near to where the Venus of Willendorf was discovered, some of the earliest evidence of Moldavite use has also been discovered, which suggests that it was traded as well. Um, the stones wouldn't actually appear in the written record, at least, until the 18th century. There's a paper written by Joseph Meyer in 1787, and he referred to them as a type of chrysolite or peridot. We know better today, but that's how he identified them from this particular region. Locals, however, knew of the stone for centuries prior to the publication. They referred to it as Vltavin, which comes from the native Czech name for a river called the Vltava, which I'm sure I'm butchering because Czech is not a language I speak. But in the 1830s, Franz Xaver Maximilian Zippe, a German naturalist, he coined the term Moldavite after Moldaltine. In other words, the river or the village on the river Moldau, which was the German name for the same river. It underwent several attempts to be popularized before it took off in the 1980s. And this is kind of fascinating because we see a kind of centennial exhibition in Czechia in its former incarnations in Prague, where it was showcased alongside other Bohemian gemstones like garnets and set-in jewelry. It didn't catch on. We see it show up again in the Art Nouveau movement, where again it was not super popular. It was often used in rough form to contrast the kind of smooth, clean lines that we associate with Art Nouveau gems. But what would really make an impact were a couple of folks who are pretty obscure in the modern crystal healing movement today. And they only ever wrote two books. Their names are Randy and Vicky Bear, Randall N. Bear and Vicky Viditau Bear, who were literal rock stars. I mean, they would pack a lecture hall with hundreds of people attending lectures on crystal healing in an era before the internet to publicize it, which was a big deal. And in their channeled material, they share in an interview that was published actually in an Australian anthology of working with crystals called The Crystal Visionary by Michael Nee. But they share that they had essentially received from their channeled work information about a green gem that fell to Earth that was going to unlock the next phase in their, we'll say, crystal journey. And in the 1980s, there was a jeweler by the name of one Robert Simmons. He was working in the kind of conventional jewelry trade at the time. You know, think rubies, diamonds, sapphires, gold, platinum, and silver, not healing crystals. But to commemorate the impending arrival of Halley's Comet, he was looking for material to celebrate that kind of went with the theme. And so after exploring a bunch of extraterrestrial and extraterrestrial adjacent gems, it was Moldavite that he really found himself drawn to, and then a series of really unexpected, fortuitous, synchronous events took place. But in his effort to understand it, he gave samples out to other writers and speakers and visionaries in the crystal movement, and that included the Bears, who kind of brought this channeled story of it having been brought to Earth by some extraterrestrial intelligence, and that has imprinted in our psyche. And now so many people think of it as a kind of extraterrestrial stone. Because we have so little in the folklore about Moldavite in particular, sometimes it's helpful to compare it to other related materials. We've already talked at length about Lisbon desert glass, which, although not technically a tektite, is very closely related. We have myths associated with tektites in many other parts of the world. To the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, we've got the eyes of the earth, as they were sometimes called, which are the little flanged button-shaped australites. We see really fanciful names all throughout Asia for tektites and some related materials, things like devil's dung and moonstones and star excrement and the arrowheads of Arjuna, and just so many others that suggest that it was something celestial in origin, which is pretty darn close. And of course, tektites as well as meteorites are among the huge body of materia that are known as thunderstones in folklore. And what I find really fascinating about the notion of thunderstones is that they cross a lot of borders, and both, we'll say, geographically and politically and linguistically, but also through time and through material itself. And these are often said to be imbued with some pretty unusual supernatural phenomena. But when it comes to actual folkloric record, I have only ever found three, we'll say, categories of folkloric and cultural meaning attributed to this in before the modern era. It is said that in Bohemia, pieces of Moldavite might be exchanged between people who are betrothed to ensure a successful and happy and romantic marriage. There is sadly no material evidence of one left over, but there is at least reference to the existence of monstrances, which are, essentially like the fancy displays that you put the consecrated host in the church, that were adorned with Moldavite. More recently in history, like in the last couple of decades, more than a couple decades now, a really beautiful rosary was made out of this that was gifted to Pope John Paul II. And then there's also some oral tradition that says Moldavite was placed in walking staves in the kind of region where it comes from, near the Vltava River and elsewhere in Bohemia, in the modern day Czechia. And this kind of begins to associate it with traveling, which is interesting because, if we think about it as a stone that was seeded by celestial or extraterrestrial intelligence, there's also some kind of travel associated with that. It would also become associated with a very infamous emerald that we've already talked about, a different green gem said to have fallen from heaven to earth, which means that Moldavite became kind of wrapped up in the myths associated with the Holy Grail and the Tabula Smaragdina, or the Emerald Tablet. And so across all of this, we start to see some themes emerge, ones of transformation, of alchemy, of connecting to our heart, of movement. And I think anyone who works with Moldavite, especially at the beginning of their Moldavite journey, they will definitely experience some kind of movement in their lives. So I find it really interesting that despite having been used by humans for tens of thousands of years, it's not until 1988 we start to really attribute some deep and mystical properties to it. And that is, of course, with the publication of the book Moldavite, Starborn Stone of Transformation.
Nicholas, a couple of questions pop up from what you shared with us then. First of all, for those that aren't aware, what crystals and stones and so on come under that category of thunderstones?
Oh, there are so many. Flint is a really popular one, especially very, very ancient, like prehistoric flint arrowheads, and knives and axe heads will often be called thunderstones. We see a variety of fossils also get called thunderstones. Echinoids in particular, or fossil urchins, are a really good example of this. Although you can find some kinds of fossil teeth and ammonites, sometimes referred to as thunderstones. I have seen pyrite folklorically called a thunderstone. Several iron ores. Pyrite is not a good iron ore because it's hard to derive this good iron out of it because of its sulfur content, but some others, including lodestone or magnetite, can be called thunderstone. But when we go through history, it's quite a big spread. There is, in fact, a little bit of evidence that perhaps precious opals could have been known as Saronia, a word that comes from the Greek word keranos, which means thunder as well. Thunderstones fascinate me to no end. In fact, in my next book, The Witching Stones, which is coming out this fall, I will talk about some of those thunderstones and their historic and magical significance as well.
Amazing. And when you're talking about the bears, they said they believe that Moldavite would help humanity in their next level of evolution. Were they specific on where they thought humanity was due to take a right turn and head?
This is where it gets interesting. I find the story of Randall Bear and Vicky Bear really fascinating because they wrote these books, Windows of Light and The Crystal Connection, in the 1980s. I think Windows of Light probably came out around 82 or 83, and The Crystal Connection in 1986, which was many times larger than their first book, and just full of these very complex diagrams of grids and other technology that you could make with crystals if only you had the means to do so. I mean, some of these grids had hundreds and hundreds of crystals in them. Ordinary people like us weren't doing this. And they were written in a language, like a register or tone, that was very dense, very abstract, full of this kind of new agey doublespeak that made it difficult to understand what the point of things were. But they were under contract for their third book, and their third book, according to this interview they gave in this Australian anthology I tracked down once, their third book was going to feature Moldavite. However, unluckily for the rest of us, that book never materialized. They underwent a conversion to a pretty radical evangelical form of Christianity, renounced a lot of their former work, wrote a book about why they renounced it, still under contract to deliver the crystal manuscript. Randy mysteriously disappears at the age of 33. Purportedly, one of the stories I've heard from someone who knew them was that he was transporting the manuscript to the publisher, because in those days you didn't email things. because that wasn't an option. You had to turn in manuscripts physically. And to my knowledge, that case was never closed, and that his remains were never recovered from the car accident that he was purportedly killed in. So obviously the manuscript was never found either. I've always had this like secret wish that there is a second copy in like a bank vault somewhere, a safety deposit box that someone is just going to uncover and go, oh, this is weird. Maybe someone will publish this. And then we'll find out what they really had to say about Moldavite.
Oh, you've just given me more questions than answers with that answer. I'm intrigued more. I'm going to move over to the US and try and find that manuscript for sure. Moldavite obviously has brought amazing experiences for a lot of people. Kyle, how do you love to work with Moldavite, and what blessings does it bring into your life?
I think in the same sort of vein, transformation, movement, it definitely has come up as something really, really important. But for me, I like to think of it as like the perfect improv partner. Like if you've ever done improv, it's yes and. And when Moldavite comes into your life to make some changes, generally you have to say yes and. Don't say no. Don't get stagnant. Don't get stuck. Moldavite is not here to let you be soft. You can soften after, right? It will often initiate the process of movement, of doing. But if you're already moving and doing, it helps you to continue and make the right choices from the heart, from a place of intuition. Because when you're making decisions on the fly, when you're able to kind of dive in and say yes as an ex-theater kid, like you create the best art, you create the best theater, you create the best entertainment, you create the best thing because you're just allowing it to come from a place of yes. And that's what Moldavite is fully in. Like, yes, and then what? And then what's next? There's always going to be, as Nicholas has given us, more questions than answers to the questions that we've just asked. And that's good, right? If you think about impactites, meteorites, tektites, they spend however many millennia traveling through space. We're here, and it goes bang, right? There are things waiting in the wings, hovering, waiting to impact, waiting to hit us, waiting to make us wake up, make a decision. There are things that happen in our lives that are shocking, terrifying, scary, whatever. And it's generally not a personal attack, although Moldavite can make us feel a bit like a victim. It can feel like it's personally attacking us because it's bringing up stuff, but it's generally because things are stagnant, things are stuck, things have been left by the wayside, things have been allowed to fester. And generally when water gets stagnant, it breeds bacteria, it breeds nasties, right? But when the water is constantly flowing, it's healthy. Everything can sort of live from it. And I find it brings that energy of like, sorry, things have been stagnant. Things have been a bit stuck. It's time to say yes, it's time to move. It actually doesn't really matter how big a movement it is. Often people think it needs to be huge because it can feel huge. But it's like, okay, we've started with the feeling. Now what's next? What do we do next? How do we move next? This was a piece I found in Amsterdam at a geologist shop in Europe in 2014 when I was over there. So I was close to the source as I've ever been. And it happened totally by chance on a trip where things were happening by chance, where it continued to kind of fall into place. Every city that I went to in Europe, I found a crystal shop. Everywhere I went, I found rocks. It just happens like that. Like when you're already in the flow of like, yes, and it can create more. Like that's why it can be really lucky. It can actually help us to create and manifest and attract abundant energy, because when we say yes to life, when we agree, when we're like, I'm going to put myself out there, I'm going to try, I'm not going to say no and close myself off, you then open yourself up to more. You can bring more in, you can create more. Yes, can be shocking, but when you say yes and what's next, you can actually move past the shock. You can move into excitement, you can move into enthusiasm, you can move into not believing how capable you are, not understanding and then registering and then going, wow, I'm amazing because I did that. And I'm going to keep doing that because that feels incredible, right? Sometimes it's about unlocking something that's there, that stagnancy, that thing that's been waiting, that comet, that meteor that's been waiting to just hit us. Sometimes we need a push. Sometimes we need a friend that's not going to baby us. Sometimes we need a little reminder of life and death, of our own mortality, of the reality of things, of the fact that maybe we're obsessed over too much minutia and we need to move into expanse and doing. Action speaks louder than words, and when we overthink, we're getting stuck in thinking. So if you need to initiate something, if you need to kind of actually get things moving and you've been a bit stuck, maybe it's a good time to reach for some Moldavite. And that's where I've had, like, these beads were actually gifted to me during a time where things were a bit stagnant and I had to move in a new direction and I have to shift the way things were going for me. And it was really important as a reminder. Like, I've already got a couple of really nice pieces, but this was like, guess what? We're still moving, we're still evolving, we're still changing. Don't lose your yes, and don't not don't hold yourself back just because things have changed, just because there are other restrictions, or it feels like, you've lost a little bit of control. You can actually regain control by letting go and doing. I hope that makes sense. It's like a positive action when you allow yourself to fall into that kind of, as the kids say nowadays, lean into it, right?
And what a real blessing that comes. We are in a bit of an era where there is a lot of fear and there's a lot of restriction, and people are worried to do things or to stand out and that type of thing. I think that real, I love that analogy of the yes and from improvisation of like, well, you only get one life, so let's make the most of it. And Moldavite kind of does give you that energy to do that, doesn't it, Kyle?
Yeah, absolutely. It really helps us to process things as well afterwards. Like, it's often through these times of busyness that you have to act, you have to make choices, you have to say yes. And then afterwards, you can then process, you can actually move a bit slower. You can let yourself go, okay, I did all of that. That was all amazing. Like, it doesn't negate the stress or the change or whatever's happening. It just allows you to do what you need to do to make things happen and, think later sometimes.
Yeah, I love that. Now, obviously, Moldavite, there seems to be, when it comes to talking to people about different crystals and stones and so on, everyone's got a story about Moldavite if they've had their experience. So I'd love to ask you, first of all, Kyle, do you have a story like your first Moldavite or something profound where Moldavite kind of rocked your world a little bit?
It was the receiving and the purchasing of this skull. So it's natural on one side, carved on one. It was during lockdown times. I'd already done work with Moldavite, got this piece. I had my very first 2 or 3 pieces. I then moved on because I'd done what I needed to. I had more pieces that came to me as gifts, but it was this chap that was like, all right, sit down and listen, right? There is more to the change than you think. And this is where I've come to this now knowing of like, it's yes, and then what, right? It's actually more than just the transformation. It's where the transformation is taking you. It's why it's transforming you. It's so much deeper than just that word. People get stuck on that word. And yes, it can be uncomfortable, but like, it's the most beautiful thing, right? It's the most amazing thing. It creates so much. And I think it's about really learning to embrace that. And it was being forced to listen to that message of yes, and what is next? Because I had gotten to a place of feeling like I couldn't see what was next because he came just before my father passed. So it was definitely one of those pieces that was just there when it was like, and this is what's next. Anything doesn't matter. Just do. Just take a step. Or you know what? Feel emotional and wallow, because that's what you need to move on, right? It's going to be different every day. And sometimes it is about feeling the feelings that have been stuck, that have been held back or that are there that you just need to. That's movement, right? That's flow. That's allowing things to go.
What about you, Nicholas? Do you remember your first time with Moldavite?
I do, and it's somewhat anticlimactic. I think the most incredible part of the story is that when I was about 12, when I bought my first piece, the retail price was $4 a gram, and I bought a 2 gram piece.
Hey,
That's
big spender.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, like, I didn't have a job. This was, like the quarters that I saved up that I found on the couch cushions kind of thing. So it was spendy for me to get an $8 rock instead of a $2 or $3 rock at the time. And I enjoyed it. It did the things people say it does, but when you're only 12 or 13, you don't have a lot of baggage to work through. So it was a really gentle integration in the grand scheme of things. So, here I am. We're just gonna say significantly older than that. We've passed 3 times that age and then some. And I mean, Moldavite's an old friend that, you catch up with for tea every so often. It's not, an earth-shattering game changer for me at this point in my life, just because I've known it for this long. And that's okay. I think it's a good reminder that the fewer expectations we have for what a crystal is going to do and how it's going to make us feel. I don't love that kind of phraseology anyway, because crystals don't make us do stuff. They invite us to experience things. They might point us towards something and then we respond, but the fewer expectations we've got built around it, the better our experience is going to be anyway.
A theory just popped into my head listening to you talk, Nicholas. Do you think the Moldavite might be the gatekeeper from someone who's kind of interested in crystals to getting really passionate about crystals? There's people out there that have their amethyst and their smoky quartz and they kind of dabble, but then you kind of find people find Moldavite and then they're like, oh my God, crystal healing is amazing. But for maybe us three individuals where we probably don't get as excited for Moldavite because it opened the door and then we're in there playing with phenakite or Libyan desert glass or Vivianite or violane or all these other rare and wonderful crystals. Do you think it could be a bit of a gatekeeper?
I think it's such a personal experience, what really
Mm.
brings people through that next thing. I think I'd crossed that threshold long before I met that piece of Moldavite. And so maybe it is for some people.
Yeah, yeah, fair enough. I know for me, when I got my first piece, which was this ring that I'm wearing now, I quite like it because it's kind of like a heart. But it was when I was working in the crystal store that it all began with for me, as being a crystal teacher, and I'd saved up for it, paid it off, popped it on, drove home, got home, and couldn't remember the 40-minute drive home. So I do kind of feel sometimes, and you hear people talk about this with Moldavite, that you shouldn't, do not drive or operate heavy machinery with it. Sometimes it does take. I've had experiences where I've run classes and allowed people to meditate with it for the first time, and some people have felt like they've had too much to drink and they've got to put their foot on the floor and different things like that as well. But it can be a really interesting stone to work with. I know also, when we work with different stones and crystals and teach, we often hear amazing stories. And one that kind of really opened my eyes about Moldavite was about this, what we call in Australia a trucker or a truckie. And he basically would drive from Western Australia across what's called the Nullarbor Plain, which is a very arid desert that stretches across a good part of middle or central Australia at the bottom, and go over to Victoria or Melbourne. So he'd drive backwards and forwards. Now he bought himself, I think him and his partner were kind of getting into crystals and stones, bought himself a Moldavite pendant, had it on a big silver chain and was just, wearing it to see what would happen. From that, he remembered one instance where he was driving in the middle of the night and his silver chain, he said, got to the temperature where he thought it was actually going to scald his skin and took it off. And for that, he was, could believe that Moldavite had this influence and that type of thing as well. Again, everyone has their own personal experiences, but Kyle, have you heard any wild and wonderful stories about massive things that have helped with or happened with Moldavite?
I've certainly heard a lot of people having like relationship things come up when working with Moldavite. Seems to be quite a big theme that I've seen personally. It's not really something I've dealt with, which is quite interesting. I don't know if that's just my own personal relationships and whatever I've done previously, but I've seen it come up a lot, especially in the younger set. But I've heard so many more stories of it going missing. That's for me a theme that I see a million times, is it going missing, or it disappearing, it moving on, it being a stone that's like, I'm done with your BS and I'm jogging on and I'm going to move on and do something else, go back to the earth, whatever it is. Like, it seems to be one that I hear about more, I think, than most as a disappearer.
Interesting. I guess as Nicholas was saying, it was used for like walking sticks, and it has this kind of essence of always wanting to move forward and always wanting to travel. I guess if you're gonna get boring, maybe it's a Sagittarius stone, Kyle. Maybe it's got to always be going on an adventure in that type of way. So yeah, it's a fascinating one. Another thing you often hear about is that pairing Moldavite with different stones as well. I know phenakite is often quoted. I consider phenakite, and I know we've had requests to do that as a separate episode, to be one, a really high vibration stone that really helps to bring, ascension and movement into your life. Herkimer diamond, I hear it paired with a lot and see it in jewelry with that, because that again helps with evolution and clarity and that type of thing. Kyle, have you any pairings that you recommend or find or hear of a lot?
My favorite is Libyan desert glass and Moldavite. I love pairing them together. I think they're so enjoyable. I think they kind of bounce off each other. I think one, even though one is maybe a little bit more subtle than the other, the Libyan desert glass, I find them that like they echo each other, they buoy each other, they kind of support, and I find them a really wonderful pair. My other favorite connection stone to work with is Tanzanite. I love the way Tanzanite supports Moldavite, again, in softening what it has to say and softening what it can bring, and kind of allowing us to be more receptive. And I also just love putting my Moldavite with any other meteorite or tektite or impactite. I have my Moldavite and my palisite together, and they, yeah, are always a good vibe.
Mm. Maybe people haven't heard of palisade, it's lesser known. Do you want to share a little bit about what palisade is quickly?
I will. Give me 2 seconds. I can show you as well. Palisite for me is the coolest of the cool. So this is a meteor that has hit the Earth, and it has olivine crystals, peridot crystals within the structure. And it's come from outer space, and it is that combination of this like metallic and crystalline, and like there is nothing like it. I have seen a coffee tabletop size piece of this lit from underneath in a billionaire's collection. Your life will never be the same when you have seen something like that. But for me, if you think about peridot being so abundant, so joyful, so heart driven, so positive, and then this like meteorite energy that's like, come on, let's do this. Like, it is like, for me, crystal crack.
Amazing. Nicholas, anything you would love to pair Moldavite with or do?
So one of my favorites is actually what I'm wearing now, which is opal and Moldavite. We've got, two forms of amorphous silica. One of them is among the driest of rocks on Earth because tektites are notoriously low on their water content, and the other one has a very high water content as far as silica goes. And there's this interesting interplay between the kind of drying and softening. It's like it's the pair of the two just stands on the cusp of the solid, the rigid, and the liquid and ineffable, which I enjoy. For those who find it an intense stone to work with. Pairing Moldavite with any grounding stone is nice. My two favorite recommendations are shungite, which is more or less an amorphous stone and has this kind of resonance with it, but has this emergent kind of structure from the debatable amount of fullerenes, which are these unusual carbon molecules inside it. And I also really love connecting it to petrified wood because, there is this memory of the petrified wood having been a living thing. It seems to really help us bridge the gap between the mineral and the animal, the, we'll say, earthly and the human. And I think that's a really nice combo if we need to gently integrate and maybe even moderate or mitigate what some of those effects of working with Moldavite are going to be.
Speaking of kind of organic matter that turns into stone or crystals, I know you're quite fond of jet. Would you pair it with jet possibly?
I never have, and I think part of my reasoning for that is that jet is just too soft and porous. It's probably not going to be anchoring enough to keep up with what Moldavite needs.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, that makes total sense for sure. So we always have a bit of a method to our madness of why we talk about different stones, and we're always open to requests and even more open to bribes. I haven't received any yet, guys. I don't know if you have yet, but send money if you want, and we'll talk about any stone. No, I'm joking. But we have a really kind of significant event. Kyle's not joking; he's just shaking his head. We have a really kind of significant event that we don't hear so much about happening later in the month of August, and that is a black new moon in Leo. So, what exactly is that? So, we know what a new moon is. That's the beginning of a new lunar cycle, and we can't see a new moon because basically the moon is hidden, and so that is the beginning of that lunar cycle. So, what makes it a black new moon? Well, you've heard of a blue moon. Now, there are different definitions of blue moon. Sometimes they say it's when you get two full moons in a month. Sometimes people say it's when you get four in a season. I personally don't use those classifications because that's relying on a Gregorian calendar that's not really that linked in with the cycles of the sun. So for me, a blue moon is when we get two full moons sequentially, one after the other, in the same zodiac sign. A black new moon is when you get two new moons in the same zodiac sign, one after the other. And so last new moon was in Leo, and this one is as well. So the new moons for me are a really great time, and I recommend people do this like a New Year's Eve. It's a time to stop, take stock in where you are, think about what happened in the year or the lunar cycle that just happened, and then also make plans for the future year. And whatever zodiac sign is in, we kind of focus on that aspect of life. So Leo, what I love, well, if you have Leos in your life, you know that they are big-hearted, they're gregarious, they're about living life to the fullest. So the Leo aspect for me is all about living a life of leisure, pleasure, and play, really fulfilling our heart. Now, when you think about what we've been talking about with Moldavite, that fits so beautifully. And when we have a black new moon, we've kind of already thought about it last lunar cycle, so let's up-level that in this kind of significant event. I read once a statement that Moldavite helps you fall back in love with life. And I love that analogy. I think, as a green crystal, I would pair it with the heart chakra. And we often hear in New Age speak that, we need to be grateful and practice your gratitude exercises. And when we are grateful, the universe gives us more. And from my experience, what I've found is that when we work with Moldavite, it just speeds up that process. It heightens our euphoric gratitude for what we have in life and accelerates our progression. And the universe goes, you can have more, you can have more. Now, sometimes I've joked and said, when people get their first bit of Moldavite, they open up their heart, they have that gratitude, they quit their job, they leave their wife, and they go live in India or something like that. And I did have one worried person once come to me and go, I don't want to get Moldavite. And I'm like, why is that? And they're like, well, I really love my partner. And I'm not going to say that we're all leaving our partners because of Moldavite. It just means that it accelerates this kind of living the life we truly want to live. And so the black new moon in Leo is more about how do you live that life of bliss? How do you live a life you want to rather than a life that you feel that you're obliged to or that you've kind of fallen into? These kind of markers come come up in life. And this is what I love about astrology when they're like, this is a special occasion. And I know sometimes it does seem on social media that every bloody full moon and everything's a special occasion. But I really do feel that a black new moon is a special occasion to really kind of go, hold on, let's make sure I am going in the direction I want. And if I'm not, I would recommend you grab your Moldavite, you get outside in that darkness on that night, place it on the heart, maybe pair it with one of the crystals that we've recommended with. I think in the Libyan desert glass episode, I talked about my tektite pentagram, where you get different tektites and pop them one above your head, one in each hand, one at the soles of the feet. If you can lay on the ground and look up at the night sky, whatever that may be, and just go, are you living life to the fullest? Because I think one thing we'd all agree on from our own experiences, stories we've been told, and the writings that have come through the last 40 to 50 years is that this is a stone that really wants you to live your best life and live it all in that type of way. So it's a really great opportunity to maybe dust off the Moldavite if it's kind of not been worked with recently. If you don't have a piece, then I don't know, cash in your superannuation or your 401k and just buy a piece. No, it may be worth, work even a small piece. And we've talked about size doesn't matter. And I think with Moldavite, if we go back and ask little Nicholas, who got his $8 piece, that still had an impact and an influence on him as well. So regardless of what you can get, I think it's a really great time to work with this stone. Boys, before we wrap up, is there any kind of warnings you think people should know about Moldavite? Do you think everyone should have a piece of Moldavite? What's your kind of lasting message for Moldavite? Because it is such an epic stone with so much hype. Does it deserve it? Should it be treated with care? What do you reckon, Kyle?
Oh, me first. Okay. I would say, yes, it is overhyped and overpriced, but it is also a really great stone that you can work with. In the same way that diamonds are overhyped and overpriced, they're still beautiful and gorgeous and make beautiful jewelry. There are things that are also, I think there is an element of like understanding that certain things come from one place. So we need to respect that, right? There is actually a limited supply. It's not that there's heaps and heaps of it out there in the world. There's probably more than we think, but we should always maybe look around. There might be someone that has a better price. There might be, especially for something like this, it might be one to do a bit of research on before you purchase if you haven't.
Yeah, for sure. Nicholas.
I love Moldavite and have owned it for a long time. I have pieces much larger and more resplendent than that very first one, but I don't know if it's just my neurodivergent self that just hates being told what to do, or if I've lived through so many of these crazes and fads with crystals that I can just see through them in a moment's notice. But I think anytime something gets really popular in the way that Moldavite did on TikTok at the onset of TikTok, we should be really cautious and very, very mindfully evaluate the claims being made about it. And this kind of came to a pinnacle in that era when I was working quite a lot, managing a local crystal shop. When someone is shopping and wants to see Moldavite because they've seen it on TikTok, and someone walks up out of the crowd to walk over to this girl. She didn't ask for any advice, and he just calmly informs her, "Oh, you don't want Moldavite. Moldavite ruined my life. My girlfriend broke up with me. My parents are always fighting with me. I recently got fired from my job. Moldavite's just the worst." And then proceeds to tell her how she should be living her life. And I thought, is it Moldavite, or are you just kind of an asshole to everybody? Because that's what I'm getting from this. And it's that confusing causation versus correlation that is at the core of so many of the problems we see in the broader body, mind, spirit world. But really, you see it coming to a head with stuff like Moldavite. Absolutely, Moldavite is a wonderful stone to work with. It is also, these days, rare and valuable and outside of the reach for a lot of folks. There are many other crystals you can work with just because something is popular doesn't mean you gotta have it. If it's within your means and it's not a stress or burden on your life to get some and you want it, go for it. But also, if you go, yeah, I'm not attracted to Moldavite, you're not required to work with it either.
I love that. And I know I said we're wrapping up, but I do feel that we need to maybe put a bit of a buyer beware warning in here as well. I've heard stories about, that cheaper versions of Moldavite are being sold from certain places, but they are basically Sprite bottles or green glass being melted and recast in shapes. Any tips from you two on how to identify if it's real or if it's not? Kyle?
The one quite distinguishing factor, well, the two main distinguishing factors that I've seen are the shade of green is quite often like there's a more earthy tone that you see to Moldavite than like the bottle green that a lot of these ones are. But some of them literally have a seam. Like they literally have the seam of the shape of the and it's like come on, it like literally has it come on. But also the evenness of the bubbles. You get bubbles in Moldavite, but it's a different shape. They're elongated. The evenness, the spherical nature of your like a kind of perfect bubbles that you see can often be a distinguishing factor. But Nicholas will probably know better than I.
So, as with anything, with practice, people get better at stuff, and that includes faking Moldavite. Once upon a time, you could spot fake Moldavite from a mile away because it just looked that bad. You often saw too many pieces exactly the same size and shape, exactly to know that they were obviously poured out of a mold. Many of these pieces, though, being sold as rough, actually have a very smooth, slick, almost like they're wet kind of surface. Again, they've been poured into a mold. But you're going to find resin and plastic and other synthetic materials. These days, they are using very fine tipped drills and other tools, as well as acid etching, preferential acid etching, where wax has been selectively applied to surfaces, so only the ones exposed get etched, that look very, very much like natural Moldavite if you don't know what you're looking for. So there's a really great book. I will forget the author's names, but it's called Moldavite Mysterious Tears from Heaven. And it has an entire chapter with lots of images about fakes and forgeries. And that's probably a really good resource for anyone. But natural Moldavite has a range in color. We think of that bottle green as like the classic color, and it actually has an old school folk name from that, Botellenstein, meaning bottle stone. But you can get really bright acid greens. You can get totally brown, virtually no hint of green in it at all. Obviously, it's the middle part of that spectrum that we know because it is the most plentiful, but there is variation. But if you see someone selling, lime green glass as Moldavite, run. I have, scouring the internet, seen people selling blue Moldavites and red Moldavites, which are also obviously very, very, very fake. So use your common sense, ask questions, buy from reputable sources. If you don't know what a reputable source is, keep asking.
Love it. Love it. Well, hopefully we've given you lots to think about and lots to explore with Moldavite. And we always love reading your comments, even if we don't get a chance to reply to them all underneath the videos and the podcast on what your experience about Moldavite and all the other crystals are. Remember that we are one big community, and it's not just about what myself and Kyle and Nicholas have shared. You sharing your stories in the comments also helps other people learn as well. So please keep them coming as well. We'll be back next week when we dive into another gift, maybe from Mother Earth, maybe like this week from the heavens. To find out, you have to wait and see. Until then, take care and blessed be.